Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today we're cracking open one of the most brutal chapters of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad, where Hitler's most powerful army walked into a trap of his own making and spent 163 days dying in the snow. Over the next few minutes, you'll see exactly how a chain of bad calls, starting all the way back in the winter of 1941, turned a confident march into a frozen nightmare. And here's the thing. Almost every mistake was avoidable. Almost. There's an old saying that generals always fight the last war, especially the last war they won. By the summer of 1942, the German High Command had convinced itself that the Soviet Union was a rotten house ready to collapse. One more push, they thought, and the whole structure would fall. Instead, that rotten house produced the bloodiest battle in human history. Before we dive in, if you're into stories where one decision changes everything, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. We've got more like this coming. So picture this. It's December 1941. The German army, the Wehrmacht, has been rolling through the Soviet Union for almost 6 months. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion codenamed after a medieval emperor, has been the biggest military gamble in modern memory. 3 million troops, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, all pouring across the border on June 22nd, hoping to knock the Soviet Union out before the snow flies. And for a while, it works. The Soviets crumble in places. Entire armies disappear. The Germans take 3 million prisoners in the first 6 months. Hitler is convinced the war in the East is already won. But there's a problem nobody at the top wants to talk about. The Russian winter doesn't care about German timetables. By early December, temperatures across the front are dropping to -30 degrees Celsius and lower. German soldiers are still wearing summer uniforms. Their rifles jam. Their tanks won't start. Their oil freezes. By mid-December, over 100,000 German troops are hospitalized with frostbite. That's the equivalent of several divisions just gone, not from bullets but from cold. The Panzers, those beautiful machines that blitzed through France, are sitting dead in the snow with cracked engines. And then, on December 16, 1941, the Soviets hit back. General Georgy Zhukov, a name you should remember, launches a massive counteroffensive right in front of Moscow. The Germans, stunned, start falling back. For the first time in the war, Wehrmacht soldiers are running, not tactically retreating, but actually running. Panic spreads. A general named Günther von Kluge, in charge of Army Group Center, reportedly told his staff that the front was like a rotten door ready to burst open. Now here's where Hitler makes the first of 5 mistakes that will eventually destroy his best army. Instead of accepting reality, he fires the commander-in-chief of the army, Walther von Brauchitsch, on December 19th, and takes personal command of the Eastern Front. He bans any further withdrawals. He demands that soldiers stand and die where they are, and when his own generals warn him that the troops cannot hold without winter clothing, without proper supplies, without a realistic plan, Hitler calls them defeatists. He says they simply lack National Socialist willpower. Think about that for a second. The most powerful military leader in Europe is blaming his own officers for not believing hard enough. The truth is, Hitler didn't want to admit that his grand invasion had been a gamble that ran out of time. He had promised the Wehrmacht would be home before Christmas. He had promised the Soviet Union would fall in 3 months. None of it happened, and instead of adjusting, he doubled down. He took direct control. He rewrote the rules, and the general staff, the professional officers who actually understood logistics, supply chains, and weather patterns, learned a very dangerous lesson. Disagreeing with the Führer ends careers. This matters hugely for what comes next, because the man who takes over as chief of the Army General Staff in the wake of this crisis is Franz Halder. Halder is competent, but he's also learned to keep his head down. He'll spend 1942 quietly trying to manage a leader who refuses to be managed. And when Halder finally pushes back, in September of that year, Hitler fires him too and replaces him with Kurt Zeitzler, a more obedient officer. By the time we get to Stalingrad, the people giving Hitler advice are mostly the ones who tell him what he wants to hear. So fast forward to spring 1942. Hitler sits down on April 5th and signs Directive Number 41, the plan for the summer campaign. The idea, in simple terms, is to swing south, grab the Caucasus oil fields, those were the Soviet Union's main source of fuel, and knock the Soviet war machine out of the war for good. The operation gets a code name, Fall Blau, Case Blue, and at first, the focus is supposed to be one clear objective, the oil. But then something weird happens. Hitler adds a second objective. He wants Stalingrad taken as well. Why? Not because of any military value. By the summer of 1942, the city of Stalingrad, which used to be called Tsaritsyn and was renamed after Stalin, is basically a husk. Most of its 600,000 residents have been evacuated. Its factories are being dismantled and shipped east to the Urals. By November of 1941, over 1,500 factories had already been relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, out of reach of German bombers. Soviet industry was rebuilding itself on the other side of the continent, far from the front. So Stalingrad isn't strategically essential, but symbolically, it's priceless. It's Stalin's city. Taking it would be a propaganda coup of the highest order. Hitler can't resist the psychological prize. And when his generals point out that splitting the southern offensive between two distant objectives is risky, Hitler brushes them off. And here's the lie that makes everything else possible. Hitler's intelligence chief, a man named Reinhard Gehlen, running an outfit called Foreign Armies East, keeps telling the Führer that Soviet reserves are almost gone, that the Red Army is bled dry. That one more push will finish them. Gehlen's reports were consistently wrong. They underestimated Soviet manpower, overestimated Soviet losses, and missed entirely how fast the Ural factories were coming online. But Hitler loved those reports. They confirmed what he already believed. So as the summer campaign kicks off in late June 1942, the German High Command is operating on a fantasy. They believe they have a short window before the next winter, before the Soviets get stronger, before the Americans and British open a second front somewhere. And they believe this window is wide enough to take both the Caucasus and Stalingrad, two objectives hundreds of kilometers apart, with one army group. It's the kind of plan that looks brilliant on a map in Berlin. It looks less brilliant when you remember what happened the previous winter. The deeper problem is psychological. Hitler has decided that the lessons of December 1941 don't apply. The winter, he believes, was a fluke. The Soviets, he believes, are finished. His generals, he believes, simply weren't tough enough. So he plans the summer of 1942 exactly the same way he planned the summer of 1941. Fast, deep, decisive, with no contingency for things going wrong. And the truly frightening part? He's surrounded by people who know better. Halder knows the logistics don't add up. Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs, who commands Army Group B, knows the southern offensive is overstretched. Manstein, who would later be sent to rescue the disaster, knows the plan is too ambitious. But the lesson of the previous winter taught them all the same thing. Speak up, and you're out. Stay quiet, and you keep your job. So when the orders come down in July 1942 to take Stalingrad while simultaneously racing for the Caucasus, nobody at the top says no. They just nod, salute, and start marching. What nobody in the German High Command realized, what they refused to realize, is that the ghosts of December 1941 weren't behind them. They were riding alongside them. The next winter was already on its way, and this time, instead of catching the Wehrmacht by surprise on the open plains near Moscow, it would catch them trapped in a city on the Volga, surrounded by an enemy they had convinced themselves was already beaten. That's where we're heading next. Because the first mistake, the arrogance of assuming winter doesn't apply, the refusal to learn from the previous catastrophe, the ideological blindness to Soviet resilience, is what set up every disaster that followed. The trap wasn't laid by Zhukov. It wasn't laid by Chuikov. It was laid by a Führer who looked at the smoking wreckage of his own previous mistake and decided to do the same thing again, only harder. And that's the moment when a string of military errors starts turning into something else entirely, a death sentence for 300,000 men. The summer of 1942 opened with the largest concentration of German firepower the Eastern Front had ever seen. Army Group South rolled forward like a steamroller. 300,000 troops, almost 1,000 tanks, thousands of guns, all pointed at the southern flank of the Soviet Union. The plan, at least on paper, was elegant. Hit the oil, cripple the Soviet war machine, end the war. The code name was Fall Blau, and the generals who designed it thought they had learned from the previous winter's catastrophe. They had not. The original blueprint came from the Army High Command, the OKH, and its chief Franz Halder. Halder was a careful, methodical officer, the kind of man who liked clean operational lines and limited objectives. His version of Case Blue focused on one thing only: the Caucasus, the oil fields around Baku, Grozny, and Maikop. Take those, and the Soviet Union loses the fuel that powers its tanks, trucks, and aircraft. Simple, logical, brutal. Halder wanted all available panzer strength committed to that single thrust, deep into southern Russia, with the Volga city of Stalingrad as nothing more than a waypoint, a protective flank guard, nothing more. But Hitler had other ideas. On July 23, 1942, Hitler issued a Buchon directive that rewrote the entire campaign. He split Army Group South into two distinct army groups. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, would race southeast toward the Caucasus oil. Army Group B, under Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs, would drive east toward Stalingrad and the Volga. Two objectives, two army groups, one summer. The decision looked reasonable in the briefing rooms of East Prussia. The Wehrmacht had grown confident after a series of quick victories in the south. They had taken Sevastopol after a long siege. They had advanced hundreds of kilometers in the early summer heat. Surely they could handle two objectives at once. Surely the Soviets, bled white by 18 months of invasion, could not resist both thrusts. They were wrong on both counts. The fatal problem was the panzer divisions. Germany's panzer force was the sharpest instrument in its army, the spearhead that had conquered Poland in 18 days, France in 6 weeks, the first 6 months of the Soviet campaign in a blur of encirclements. But there were only so many of them. By mid-1942, the Wehrmacht had roughly 20 panzer divisions on the Eastern Front. They could not be in two places at once. And Hitler, obsessed with both the oil and the symbolic prize of Stalingrad, tried to do exactly that. The initial allocation showed the imbalance clearly. Army Group A received the 1st Panzer Army under General Ewald von Kleist, the 17th Army under General Hermann Hoth, and later the 4th Panzer Army. Army Group B received the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus, a careful, intellectual officer who had never held an independent command before this. The 4th Panzer Army, the most powerful mobile formation in the south, was supposed to support both objectives, shuttling between them like a rented tool. Its commander, Hermann Hoth, would spend the summer moving his tanks back and forth across hundreds of kilometers of dusty steppe, exhausting his crews, wearing out his engines, and never delivering a decisive blow anywhere. The advance began on June 28th. Army Group B attacked first, punching through Soviet defenses in the Great Bend of the Don River. The Soviets, surprised by the weight of the blow, gave ground. Within days, German spearheads were racing east, aiming for the great river that divided the southern Russian plains. Army Group A followed, pushing southeast toward Rostov-on-Don and the gateway to the Caucasus. By early August, both objectives seemed within reach. Kleist's panzers crossed the Don and entered the Caucasus foothills. His troops captured the oil town of Maikop on August 9, 1942. But the prize was hollow. The Soviets had destroyed the wells before withdrawing. Pumping equipment was blown up. Storage tanks were burned. What the Germans seized was a smoking wasteland, not fuel for their tanks. Worse, the distances were enormous. The drive from Rostov to Baku, the ultimate objective, covered more than 1,000 kilometers through some of the worst terrain in Europe. Mountain passes, narrow roads, and endless supply lines stretched to breaking point. Meanwhile, Paulus's Sixth Army reached the western outskirts of Stalingrad in late August. On August 23rd, a small German patrol crossed the Volga, the first time any German soldier had stood on that bank. The city, stretched along the great river for more than 40 kilometers, seemed ripe for capture. But the Volga was not just a river. It was a barrier. The eastern bank was firmly in Soviet hands. Soviet artillery on the far shore could fire across the water at any time, and the city itself, with its factories, apartment blocks, and rubble-filled streets, would have to be taken meter by meter. Hitler, watching the reports pour into his Wolf's Lair headquarters, refused to acknowledge the spreading strain. He saw Stalingrad as the symbolic prize that would convince the world that Germany was winning. He saw the Caucasus as the economic prize that would fuel his armies for years. He wanted both, and when his generals warned him that the two objectives were pulling his forces apart like a wishbone, he ignored them. The evidence of overstretch was everywhere. Supply lines had grown thin. German logistics officers complained that the railways could not keep up with demand. Truck columns crawled through the summer heat, engines overheating, drivers exhausted. Luftwaffe reconnaissance reported Soviet troop movements on the flanks, but Hitler dismissed them as local defensive actions, not the buildup of a strategic counteroffensive. His intelligence chief, Reinhard Gehlen, kept assuring him that Soviet reserves were minimal, that the Red Army had spent its last reserves defending Stalingrad itself. By late August, the strategic disaster was already baked in. Army Group A, deep in the Caucasus, had outrun its supply lines and could not advance further without fuel. Army Group B, focused on Stalingrad, had left its northern flank weakly held, defended mostly by Romanian and Hungarian formations that were poorly equipped and even more poorly motivated. The two army groups had lost operational contact with each other. The 600 kilometers between Rostov-on-Don and Stalingrad was held by a thin screen of Allied troops and a handful of German security divisions. On September 24, 1942, Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, was dismissed. Hitler had grown tired of Halder's cautious objections. The new chief of the Army General Staff was Kurt Zeitzler, a younger, more compliant officer who understood what his master wanted to hear. With Zeitzler installed, the last institutional check on Hitler's strategic fantasies was effectively silenced. From that moment on, bad news would travel upward only after it had been smoothed and softened, and even then it might be ignored. The final irony of the split came in October. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, the formation that had been shuttled between Stalingrad and the Caucasus all summer, was ordered north yet again. This time it was supposed to crush a Soviet bridgehead across the Don at Serafimovich and relieve the pressure on the German-held river line. But by the time the panzers arrived, they were spent. Tank crews had been fighting or marching since June. Engines had logged thousands of kilometers in the summer heat. The magnificent machines that had terrified Europe 2 years earlier were breaking down at alarming rates. Hoth's offensive in mid-October punched a hole in the Soviet lines and relieved the Serafimovich bridgehead, but it could not restore the lost momentum. Meanwhile, Paulus was bogged down in Stalingrad, fighting for every factory district and every streetcar line, while Soviet reinforcements poured across the Volga under his nose. The bifurcation of the southern offensive had created a trap that closed around the Germans themselves. By splitting his forces between two distant objectives, Hitler had guaranteed that neither could be achieved decisively. By dividing his panzer strength, he had ensured that no single formation possessed the overwhelming combat power needed to break through Soviet defenses. By ignoring his general's warnings, he had created an operational situation where a determined Soviet counteroffensive could strike the weak seams between the army groups and roll up the entire southern front. The stage was set for catastrophe. But the worst mistake, the order that would turn a difficult situation into a death sentence, was still to come. Because even now, even with his army stretched thin and his flanks held by unreliable allies, Hitler refused to consider retreat. He refused to pull back to shorter, more defensible lines. He refused to let Paulus disengage from the urban nightmare of Stalingrad and maneuver in the open steppe where German tactical superiority could flourish. Instead, he demanded that his soldiers stand and fight in a city that was devouring them, waiting for an enemy that was quietly, methodically, preparing to encircle them. The split army was the strategic foundation of the disaster. The refusal to abandon the city would be the tactical tomb. The summer heat was beginning to fade across the southern Russian steppe, but the air over Stalingrad was thickening with smoke and dust. By late August of 1942, General Friedrich Paulus had reached the great western bend of the Volga River with his Sixth Army. His tanks had rolled across hundreds of kilometers of open country. His infantry had broken through Soviet defensive lines. Now, at last, he stood on the threshold of the prize Hitler had promised him. The city of Stalingrad lay ahead, sprawling along the riverbank for more than 40 kilometers, a place that Hitler wanted captured not because it made military sense, but because it bore the name of his rival. For Paulus, the campaign seemed almost over. A few more days, he thought, a few more determined pushes, and the flag would fly over the ruins of Stalin's namesake city. He had no idea that those few more days would stretch into the longest, bloodiest urban battle in human history. The first thing to understand about Stalingrad is that it was never supposed to be a city fight. The German army in 1942 was the inheritor of a doctrine called Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement. Their strength lay in speed, in maneuver, in the ability to punch through enemy lines, encircle huge formations, and destroy them before they could react. That doctrine had shattered Poland in 18 days. It had rolled over France in 6 weeks. It had driven deep into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. For the Wehrmacht, the recipe was simple. Keep moving. Never get bogged down. Let the panzers do the talking. Stalingrad was the exact opposite of that recipe. A city is a killer of momentum. Every street becomes a firing line. Every building becomes a fortress. Every room becomes a battlefield. Tanks cannot maneuver through rubble. Artillery cannot see its targets. Air support cannot tell friend from foe when the fighting is measured in meters. The whole elegant machinery of German mobile warfare grinds to a halt the moment the troops enter the urban labyrinth. The German generals knew this. Paulus himself knew this. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who would later arrive to try to rescue the situation, knew this better than anyone. But Hitler, in his distant headquarters, did not want to know it. He wanted Stalingrad taken, street by street, block by block, until the name itself belonged to Germany. And so the order went down. No bypass, no encirclement, no quick thrust to seal off the city. Paulus would capture it the hard way, the slow way, the way that would destroy his army one basement at a time. The Soviets, for their part, had been preparing for exactly this kind of fight. In early September of 1942, General Vasily Chuikov took command of the 62nd Army, the formation tasked with defending the city. Chuikov was a hard man, shaped by years of combat, and he understood something that many of his predecessors had not. In a city, the defender has enormous advantages. Every ruin provides cover. Every factory becomes a strong point. Every subway tunnel becomes a supply route. A small force, fighting among familiar rubble, can hold off an enemy many times its size, provided the defenders are willing to die in place, and provided reinforcements can reach them. Chuikov developed a doctrine that sounds almost suicidal, but turned out to be brutally effective. He told his troops to get as close to the Germans as possible. Move within grenade range, he ordered. Move within bayonet range. Hug the enemy so tightly that the German artillery cannot fire without hitting their own men. Hug the enemy so tightly that the German bombers cannot drop their payloads without killing their own soldiers. The idea was to negate the German advantages in firepower, in artillery, in air support, by using the bodies of Soviet soldiers as a shield. It worked. The fighting in Stalingrad unfolded across landmarks that would become famous. Mamayev Kurgan, the great earthen mound that dominated the city, changed hands a dozen times in a single week. The Barakati factory, a sprawling complex of steel and concrete, held out for 2 months against repeated German assaults. The Red October plant, where steel had once been rolled for Soviet industry, became a vertical battlefield, fought over floor by floor, stairwell by stairwell. The grain elevator, a vast concrete structure near the river, became a tomb for hundreds of German soldiers who tried to storm its doors and failed. What made the defense possible was the Volga itself. The great river, more than a kilometer wide at Stalingrad, marked the boundary between the battle and the rest of the Soviet Union. On the eastern bank, Soviet reserves could be assembled, fed, and rested. On the western bank, the 62nd Army held a shrinking strip of ruins along the river bank, sometimes only a few hundred meters wide. Between them ran a ferry service that became one of the bravest logistical operations in military history. Every night, under continuous German artillery fire and frequent Luftwaffe bombing, boats and pontoons crossed the Volga, carrying reinforcements to the western bank. The survivors of the destroyed regiments were ferried back to be rebuilt. Fresh divisions crossed in the darkness, landing on shattered piers and scrambling up broken embankments into the burning city. The 13th Guards Rifle Division, under General Alexander Rodimtsev, crossed the river in early September and immediately hurled itself into the fighting around Mamayev Kurgan. The 284th Division crossed later. The 92nd Brigade crossed in October. Wave after wave of Soviet soldiers came across that terrible water, landing in a place where the average life expectancy was measured in hours, and went forward to fight. This was the second piece of Hitler's catastrophic mistake. By ordering Paulus to take the city, instead of bypassing it, he had turned the Volga into a permanent Soviet highway. Every meter of ground the Germans gained could be replaced overnight. Every German soldier lost in the rubble could not be replaced at all. The Soviets were spending lives, and lives were the one resource they had in seemingly inexhaustible supply. The Germans were spending something far more precious: trained veterans, irreplaceable specialists, men who understood how to operate the complex machinery of modern combined arms warfare. The losses on both sides were staggering. By the end of October, the German 6th Army had suffered almost 200,000 casualties since the campaign began. Some divisions were reduced to half their nominal strength. Some infantry battalions could muster only a few hundred men for a full assault. The panzer units, the elite of the German army, were being worn down by the endless street fighting, their tanks easy targets for Soviet anti-tank teams, hiding in basements and on upper floors. On the Soviet side, the numbers were even worse. Estimates suggest that something like 280,000 Soviet soldiers died in the urban fighting of Stalingrad, with another 300,000 wounded. The 62nd Army, the formation that held the Western Bank, was rebuilt so many times that by November it contained soldiers from almost every ethnic group in the Soviet Union: Russians and Ukrainians and Kazakhs and Georgians and Tartars, all thrown into the same burning cauldron. While the infantry bled in the ruins, the commanders above them were making decisions that would determine whether all that blood was spent in vain. Chuikov, on the Soviet side, was preparing the ground for a counteroffensive that would encircle the entire German position. Paulus, on the German side, was quietly informing his superiors that his army was exhausted, his supplies were running low, and the city could not be taken by assault before winter. The generals around Paulus agreed. The corps commanders agreed. Even some of the most fanatical Nazi officers on the Eastern Front agreed. Manstein, who had been appointed to command the newly formed Army Group Dawn in late November, made one of the most urgent warnings of the war. He told Hitler directly that the Sixth Army could not be supplied through the air. He told Hitler that the flanks of the German position, held by Romanian and Italian formations, were dangerously weak. He told Hitler that the only sensible course was to allow Paulus to break out of his bridgehead on the Volga and retreat to shorter lines before the Soviets struck. Hitler refused. On November 20th, 1942, the very day that the Soviet offensive Operation Uranus was about to begin, Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe, arrived at Hitler's mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden and made a promise that would doom 300,000 men. Göring, a former fighter pilot who had not flown a combat mission in years, a morphine addict who had grown fat on the rewards of the Reich, assured the Führer that his air force could supply the encircled Sixth Army from the sky. He promised 300 tons of supplies per day. The actual minimum requirement was 500 tons. The actual maximum that the Luftwaffe ever delivered during the entire siege was around 90 tons, and on many days, the number was far lower. The promise was absurd on its face. The Luftwaffe had never sustained a large encircled force by air. Its transport aircraft were too few, its airfields too distant, its fighters too stretched. But Göring wanted to please his master. Hitler wanted to hold Stalingrad. So the fantasy was accepted as fact, and the Sixth Army was ordered to stand and fight in a pocket that would soon be surrounded by 7 Soviet armies. The trap was closing. The Soviets had been preparing Operation Uranus for months, massing over 1 million troops, more than 1,700 tanks, over 13,000 guns, on the weak flanks held by the Romanian and Hungarian allies of Germany. When the offensive began on November 19th, it fell on formations that had neither the equipment nor the motivation to resist. The Romanian soldiers, who had been told they were defending Europe from Bolshevism, broke and ran within hours. The Soviet pincers, racing through the steppe on either side of the German position, met at Kalak-on-Don on November 23rd, sealing the ring around Paulus and his army. The Sixth Army was now a corpse that did not yet know it was dead. Inside the pocket, the situation deteriorated with every passing day. Fuel for the tanks ran out. Ammunition for the artillery was rationed. Bread was distributed in tiny frozen blocks. The wounded froze to death in unheated buildings. The dead were stacked in courtyards because there was no longer any way to bury them. German soldiers who had once dreamed of conquering the Soviet Union now huddled in cellars and prayed for relief that never came. Manstein attempted one last rescue. On December 12, 1942, he launched Operation Winter Storm, a thrust by the 57th Panzer Corps under Hermann Hoth, aimed at breaking through to the Sixth Army from the southwest. For a few desperate days, the relief force fought forward through the Soviet lines, reaching within 48 kilometers of the pocket. The artillery of the Sixth Army could hear the guns of Hoth's tanks. Radio messages flew back and forth. Paulus was told to break out toward Hoth, to meet him halfway, to create a corridor through which the encircled army could escape. Hitler forbade it. The Führer, obsessed with the symbolic value of Stalingrad, with the propaganda of holding the city named after Stalin, with his own refusal to admit that the position was hopeless, ordered Paulus to stay put. The army would be supplied from the air, he insisted. Göring had promised. The Führer's word was law, and so the Sixth Army, within sight of rescue, remained in its shrinking pocket, waiting for an airlift that delivered a fraction of what was needed. By the end of December, even Winter Storm had failed. Hoth's panzers, outnumbered and out of fuel, withdrew to their starting positions. A second Soviet offensive, Operation Little Saturn, smashed through the Italian Eighth Army on the Chir River and threatened to encircle Manstein's entire relief force. The southern front of the German army was collapsing. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the end approached with terrible slowness. Paulus, by early January of 1943, was a broken man. He divided what remained of his army into northern and southern pockets and prepared for the final Soviet assault. On January 24th, Hitler, in a gesture of cruel theater, promoted every general of the Sixth Army, including Paulus himself, to the rank of field marshal. No German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner, Hitler reasoned. A field marshal was expected to die rather than surrender. The message was clear. Paulus understood it. He surrendered anyway. On January 31st, 1943, the southern pocket fell. Paulus walked into Soviet captivity along with his staff. The northern pocket held out for 2 more days. On February 2, 1943, the last German soldiers in Stalingrad laid down their arms. The battle was over. 163 days had passed since the first German soldier crossed the Volga at Stalingrad in August of the previous year. Inside the pocket, more than 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Most of them would die in Soviet captivity over the following years. Only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again, returning in batches in 1955 and 1956, ghosts of an army that once believed it could conquer the world. The city itself was a ruin. Most of its buildings had been destroyed. The civilian population had been evacuated, killed, or absorbed into the fighting. The Volga ran red with the blood of soldiers and civilians. The smoke from the fires had blocked out the sun for weeks. Stalingrad had become a name that meant something new, not just a city on a river, but the graveyard of an entire German army. What made it all unnecessary was the pattern of decisions that led to it. Hitler had ordered a mobile war to be fought as a siege. He had ordered a city to be taken at the cost of an army. He had refused to allow a breakout when one was still possible. He had trusted an airlift that any competent airman would have known was impossible. Each of these decisions alone might have been survivable. Together, they created a cascade of disaster that no army in the world could have survived. The ghosts of December 1941 had finally caught up with the Wehrmacht, and this time, they did not let go. The pocket was sealed, and the death of an army became a slow, public performance. For weeks, the world watched through German communiques and Soviet broadcasts as 6 army groups, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers, more than 1,700 tanks, and over 13,000 guns closed around Paulus and his command. The pincer met at Kalak-on-Don on November 23, 1942. A rifleman from one Soviet division shook hands with a rifleman from another in the middle of a frozen steppe, and the ring tightened. Inside that ring stood the 6th Army, fragments of the 4th Panzer Army, and various rear area troops, more than 300,000 men in total, along with thousands of vehicles and tons of equipment. They had fuel for perhaps 6 days. They had ammunition for less. They had bread for even less. And they had a Führer who had decided, in the warm rooms of the Wolf's Lair, that they would not retreat. The order came down on November 22nd. The 6th Army would hold its position on the Volga. It would be supplied from the air. No breakout would be permitted without explicit Führer authorization. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who had taken command of the newly formed Army Group Don, urged the opposite course. He asked for permission to pull Paulus back to the Don River line, to shorten the front, to preserve the army as a fighting instrument for the spring. Hitler refused. The symbolic value of Stalingrad outweighed, in his mind, the operational value of 300,000 men. While the generals debated in distant headquarters, the soldiers inside the pocket began to learn what it meant to be forgotten. The temperature dropped steadily. By December, it stood at -20 and lower across the open ground. Frostbite joined combat trauma as the leading cause of evacuation. The wounded lay in unheated cellars and factory floors, wrapped in newspapers and rags, waiting for transport that would never come. The dead were stacked in courtyards because the ground had frozen too hard to dig, and because there were too many of them to bury individually. Latrines froze. Water rationing became a grim arithmetic measured in spoonfuls. The Luftwaffe, struggling against weather, distance, and Soviet fighters, delivered an average of around 90 tons of supplies per day. The minimum required to keep the army functioning was 500. The gap was not a logistical problem. It was a death sentence signed in triplicate. Manstein made one final attempt. On December 12, 1942, he launched Operation Winter Storm, a strike by the 57th Panzer Corps under General Hermann Hoth, aimed at cutting through to the 6th Army from the southwest. For a few desperate days, the relief force fought forward through Soviet blocking positions. By December 19th, Hoth's spearhead had reached a point roughly 48 kilometers from the edge of the pocket. The artillery of the encircled army could hear the distant rumble of friendly guns. Radio operators typed urgent messages back and forth. Paulus was ordered to break out toward Hoth, to begin a fighting withdrawal that would link the two forces and save the army. Hitler, once again, said no. Stalingrad would not be given up. Göring had promised an airlift. The Führer's word bound the army in place. The chance was lost. Hoth's panzers, low on fuel and ammunition, faced fresh Soviet divisions rushed in from the Caucasus. By Christmas, they had fallen back to their starting positions. A second Soviet offensive, Operation Little Saturn, smashed through the Italian 8th Army on the Chir River on December 16th, tearing a hole in the outer German front and threatening to encircle Manstein's entire Army Group Don. The southern wing of the German position began to unravel. Romanian and Hungarian formations dissolved under the shock of coordinated armored attacks. German security divisions, stretched across hundreds of kilometers, fought isolated rearguard actions and vanished. The strategic position that had existed in November no longer existed at all. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, January opened with the certainty of ending. Paulus divided his remaining forces into a northern group and a southern group, each clinging to a fragment of the former front line. Soviet infantry worked their way forward through the rubble, supported by massed artillery and direct tank fire at point-blank range. The Germans fought back with desperate skill, but every position lost was not retaken. Every casualty reduced the strength of a formation that had no reserves. Every day of cold weather drained the bodies of men who had once marched through the heat of the Caucasus foothills. On January 24, 1943, a final dispatch arrived from the Wolf's Lair. Hitler, in a gesture of theatrical cruelty, promoted every general of the 6th Army, including Paulus himself, to the rank of field marshal. The reasoning, as conveyed through channels, was that no German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. A field marshal was expected to die rather than surrender. The implicit message was understood by everyone who received it. Paulus understood it. He surrendered anyway. On January 31, 1943, the southern pocket fell silent. Paulus walked into Soviet captivity, accompanied by his senior staff, the first German field marshal ever to be taken alive by an enemy. The northern group held out for 2 more days, fighting among the ruins of the tractor factory and the frozen quays along the Volga. On February 2, 1943, the last German soldiers in Stalingrad laid down their arms. The battle that had begun when a small German patrol crossed the Volga on August 23 of the previous year had lasted 163 days. The number itself became a kind of historical shorthand, a measure of how long an army could die in front of the world. The aftermath unfolded in stages. More than 91,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity in the days after the surrender. Of those, only about 5,000 would ever return to Germany, in small groups released between 1955 and 1956. The rest died in prison camps of malnutrition, disease, exposure, and neglect. Their names were never fully recorded. Their families received telegrams that said simply, "missing in action," or "died in captivity." The Soviet Union sealed the files and moved on to the next offensive. The strategic consequences rippled outward faster than the human ones. Germany's allies on the Eastern Front, The Romanians, the Hungarians, the Italians began to calculate their own odds of survival. Within months, several of them would search secretly for separate peace terms with the Western Allies. The Japanese, observing from their embassy in Berlin, noted that Germany could not rescue a surrounded army of that size and quietly revised their own strategic expectations. The British and American public, fed stories of Soviet resistance, began to believe that the war in Europe might actually end in victory rather than negotiated exhaustion. Stalingrad became a symbol long before the last prisoner was processed, a proof that the Wehrmacht could be broken, that the Eastern Front could turn, that the Third Reich was mortal after all. What made the defeat so heavy was not a single decision. It was the accumulation of decisions made over months, each one removing a little more flexibility from the German position, each one making the next compromise a little harder to avoid. The refusal to learn from the winter of 1941 created the strategic fantasy of the summer campaign. The split of Army Group South weakened both objectives and exposed the flanks. The decision to take Stalingrad street by street turned mobile warfare into siege warfare and turned the Volga into a permanent Soviet highway. The order not to retreat turned a dangerous situation into a hopeless one. The belief in Göring's airlift sealed the pocket against any practical rescue. Each mistake was a doorway to the next one, and the Führer walked through every door he came to. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme. The patterns that destroyed the Sixth Army at Stalingrad have reappeared in every strategic catastrophe since, in the refusal to update doctrine, in the preference for symbolic victory over operational sense, in the silencing of professional advisors, in the substitution of willpower for logistics. The lesson is not that generals are foolish. The lesson is that the distance between a confident headquarters and a frozen pocket can close in a single winter, and that the men inside the pocket always pay the price for the confidence above them. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with the story until the end. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this. Drop a comment telling me which battle you want covered next, and I will see you in the next one.